There are moments in this job, and I've had enough of them over the years to know, where you feel the air change before anything actually happens. Not a sound, not a movement you can point to. Just something. A shift, like the building itself is holding its breath. I felt that on a Tuesday morning in early November, the kind of Tuesday that doesn't announce itself. Cold, gray, the sort of London morning where the sky looks like wet concrete and everyone walks a little faster just to stay warm. I'd done the handover at 06:40, taken my post, and settled into the particular kind of stillness that this work demands. You learn it or you don't last. You learn to be present without fidgeting, alert without looking anxious. A human fixture that people trust because you never seem rattled. That morning, I was rattled. I just didn't show it yet. My name doesn't matter for the purposes of what I'm about to tell you. What matters is the position and the years. 12 years at that point of household service. I've been attached to various principals across those years, transferred between residences, rotated through protection details that I'm not at liberty to describe in full. I'd seen things that surprised me. I'd seen things that quietly disturbed me. I'd seen the machinery of a royal household from angles that most people, even most people who work in it, never see. But I had never, in 12 years, done what I did that Tuesday. I'd never broken protocol to enter a room I wasn't assigned to. I'd never interrupted a private meeting. And I'd certainly never done both at once, in the same 2 minutes in front of witnesses. That morning, I did all three. And before you make assumptions about what that means or why, let me take you back to the beginning. Because nothing about that morning was simple, and nothing about my decision was reckless. If it looked reckless from the outside, and I know it did, I saw the faces. Then that's the nature of a decision made in about 11 seconds with incomplete information, and a very specific set of concerns pressing down on you all at once. Let me take you back to where it started. The building I'm referring to wasn't Buckingham Palace itself, though that's a natural assumption. It was a secondary administrative residence, one of several properties within the broader royal estate network used for working purposes rather than ceremonial ones. I'm deliberately keeping the location vague, not out of evasion, but out of respect for the protocols that still govern what I can say publicly. Call it a working house, a place where meetings happen, papers get signed, schedules get built and torn apart and rebuilt again. Not glamorous. Carpeted corridors that smell faintly of old wood and something institutional, like a very expensive hospital. Portraits on the walls that you stop seeing after your first week. It was, on most mornings, a quiet place. That morning it wasn't. Not because anything was loud, quite the opposite. It was the particular quiet of people being careful about noise, which, once you've been trained to notice it, is a completely different thing from ordinary silence. I'd come on early because Whitmore had called in sick. Daniel Whitmore, 9 years in service, responsible man, never called in sick without genuine cause, but he'd rung in just after 5 that morning. Some kind of chest infection his wife was insisting he see a doctor about. So the shift supervisor, a woman named Priya, had asked me to cover an extended rotation. I said yes, of course I said yes. That yes is what put me in the corridor outside the Lawson room at 09:17 on a Tuesday morning. If Whitmore hadn't been ill, I'd have been posted 2 floors down near the service entrance, where nothing of any consequence was happening. But Whitmore was ill, and I was where I was. The Lawson room, I'm naming it that because that's what the staff called it, after a former household secretary whose painting hangs in the far corner, was a mid-sized meeting room on the 2nd floor. Oval table, 8 chairs, a sideboard with a thermos that was always refilled at 08:30. It was used for internal household meetings, private briefings, occasionally for conversations that required a degree of discretion that the larger rooms didn't naturally provide. That morning, it was in use. I knew that because the door had a small indicator system, nothing electronic, just a sliding brass panel that the person inside could push across to indicate occupied, and the panel was across. There was also a staff member I didn't recognize stationed near the door, not in uniform. A civilian, mid-40s, in a dark jacket, standing with the kind of practiced stillness that told me he wasn't just an assistant who happened to be loitering. He was positioned, that's the word. He had a position and he was holding it. I noted him, filed him in the part of my brain that tracks people who don't quite fit, and continued my rotation. Let me tell you something about the culture of this work. You don't ask, that's the foundational rule, and it's not written anywhere, it doesn't have to be. You don't ask what's in the room, you don't ask who's meeting, you don't ask what's being discussed. You observe the indicators, the brass panel, the staff positioning, the schedule notations that have been partially redacted for your clearance level, and you calibrate your presence accordingly. Close enough to respond, far enough to not be intrusive. You are, in the bluntest possible terms, furniture with training. And for 12 years, I'd been very good furniture. That morning, something pulled at me in a way that furniture doesn't get pulled. It started with a sound. Not a loud sound, not a shout or a crash or anything that would have been immediately actionable. Something quieter than that. Something I heard through the door, and the Lawson room's door was thick, solid oak. The kind of door that does its job, as I passed on my third rotation past that end of the corridor. A voice rising, then being pulled back down. Not an argument, exactly. More like the beginning of one that someone was actively suppressing. I slowed without meaning to, caught myself, kept moving. But at the end of the corridor, where the camera had a known blind spot, it's a structural quirk of that building, we all knew about it, I stopped and thought. What I knew, in terms of what was officially available to me. The morning schedule had a notation, meeting, Lawson room 0900, without further attribution. That wasn't unusual. High-level meetings routinely appeared on the household schedule without named participants, to protect against information reaching people who didn't need it. What I did not know officially, who was in that room. What I did know from other channels. The woman I'd seen walking from the East Wing at 08:51, accompanied by two people I recognized as senior household staff. A brisk walk, not a ceremonial one, the walk of someone who had somewhere specific to be and didn't particularly want to be seen getting there. I recognized her. I'd been in proximity to her enough times, across enough years, to know that walk from a distance. And I knew that she had, in the weeks prior, been mentioned in conversations I'd partially heard, the kind of partial hearing that happens when you're standing near an open door and two senior aides are talking in what they think are quiet voices, in connection with something involving a restructuring. A process, something to do with the younger members of the family. I want to be precise here because precision matters. I did not have full information. I had fragments. Fragments that in isolation meant nothing. But fragments that were assembling themselves in my mind with an urgency I was having trouble explaining even to myself. The man in the dark jacket near the door, I noticed him again on my fourth pass. He'd moved slightly, just a foot to the left, small adjustment. The kind you make when you're starting to feel the weight of standing in one place. But he'd also done something else. He'd taken out a phone, not unusual, and was holding it in a way that suggested he was reading something rather than waiting for a call. And the phone was angled just enough that I caught, for about 2 seconds, a glimpse of what was on the screen. A document or something formatted like one. I couldn't read the text, but the structure, the headers, the spacing, the way it was laid out in sections looked like a briefing note, or a plan. He put it away when he noticed me slowing. He looked at me directly. I looked back, held it for exactly 1 second, then continued past. My pulse was doing something I didn't like. Here is the thing about intuition in this work. It is not dismissed. In training, real operational training, not the ceremonial component, they spend actual time on what they call environmental reading. The interpretation of signals that don't rise to the level of explicit threat but accumulate. The recognition of wrongness before it becomes visible wrongness. They tell you, trust the accumulation. Not any single thing, the accumulation. I was accumulating. I need to tell you about the conversation I'd had 3 days earlier with a woman named Sonia Aldridge. Sonia was a household coordinator, brilliant woman, 22 years of service, knew the internal workings of that building the way a musician knows an instrument. We'd worked alongside each other enough times that we'd developed the easy shorthand of colleagues who respect each other without being particularly close friends. She'd found me in the staff corridor near the linen cupboard on a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual enough on its own. Sonia didn't seek people out. She was the type who waited for people to come to her. She said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" I said yes because you do, but I remember my guard going up at the phrasing. She said, "Have you noticed anything different about the scheduling in the last 2 weeks? The internal kind, not the public-facing calendar." I said I had noticed some anomalies, which was true. She said, "There's a meeting being arranged. I can't tell you more than that. That isn't going through the normal approval chain. It's being scheduled around the normal chain, which means someone is either expediting it at a level above where I sit, or someone is keeping it out of the usual records on purpose." I asked her what kind of meeting. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "The kind that involves decisions about people who can't be party to the meeting being called to make decisions about them." Then she walked away. No explanation, no context. I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since. At 09:23, I was at the far end of the corridor when I heard the door to the Lawson room open. I turned. A woman came out, not the principal I'd seen arriving, but one of the senior aides. She was carrying a folder and moving quickly, too quickly. She went to the stairwell door at the corridor's end, pushed through, and was gone. The man in the dark jacket had stepped to the side to let her pass. The door to the Lawson room, in the process, had not fully closed behind her. It was open, barely, a 2-inch gap. And through that gap, I want to be very clear that this was not something I sought out. It was simply what I could hear from where I was standing at the corridor's end. Through that gap, I heard a voice. Clear, distinctive. And I heard 3 words that changed the calculation entirely. "Not without their consent." That was one voice, firm, a little strained. Then another voice, measured lower, with the cadence of someone who is accustomed to being listened to. "Consent will be managed. That's what this process is for." Then the door was pulled shut from inside. And I stood there for about 4 seconds, completely still, running those 2 sentences against everything else I'd been accumulating for 3 days. Consent will be managed. That phrase, I want to try to describe what a decision like the one I then made actually feels like from the inside. Because from the outside it must look like either heroism or insanity, and it was neither. It felt like a very cold, very clear narrowing. Like the rest of the world, the corridor, the portraits on the walls, the faint institutional smell, the sound of someone's shoes on the floor above me, all of it went slightly dim. And what remained bright, right in the center of my attention, was a very simple question. If I am wrong about what I think is happening, what is the consequence of what I'm about to do? And then the other question, the one that canceled out the first. If I am right and I don't do anything, what is the consequence of that? 12 years. I'd spent 12 years asking myself the first question, following protocol precisely because protocol protects against the chaos of individual judgment. I believed in protocol. I still believe in it. But there is a version of protocol that has been designed to protect people. And there is another version, a corrupted version, that protects a process at the expense of people. I believed in that moment, standing in that corridor with my pulse in my throat, that what I was hearing was the second kind. I walked to the door. I knocked once, 1 knock sharp, which is the code for security presence rather than general interruption. I did not wait for a response. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I knew it. Oval table, 8 chairs, 4 of which were occupied, the thermos on the sideboard, the portrait in the corner, the gray November light coming through the windows on the far wall. 4 faces turned toward me. I recognized all of them. One of them, the one seated at the head of the table, with papers arranged in front of her and a stillness that communicated decades of handling unexpected situations, looked at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not anger, not surprise. Something that was, I think, closer to assessment. Like she was deciding, very rapidly, what category of problem I represented. I had about 3 seconds to make my case. I used them. In the training that forms the foundation of this work, there is a module, not the longest one, but in retrospect one of the most important, on what they call escalation without aggression. The principle is simple. There are situations where you must insert yourself into a space or a conversation that is not yours to insert yourself into, and how you do that in the first 5 seconds determines everything that follows. You don't enter aggressive. You don't enter apologetic. You enter with what the training calls grounded urgency, a composure that communicates both that you have good reason to be there and that you're not a threat to the room. You make yourself readable. You give the room's occupants something they can process quickly. A uniform, a posture, a face that isn't panicking. I had practiced that module. I drilled it. I hadn't expected to use it in quite this configuration. 4 people at the table. I'll describe them without using names, because names are where I have to be careful. At the head, a woman in her 70s, impeccably composed in a dark blazer with reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair. The papers in front of her were face down. She had turned them over when I'd knocked. I noticed the motion as I opened the door. Deliberate, practiced. To her right, a man I recognized as a senior legal advisor, late 50s, the build of someone who'd once been athletic and now carried the same energy in a softer frame. He was holding a pen that he'd stopped moving when I entered. To her left, a woman I knew as a household secretary of long standing, mid-60s. She had a leather portfolio in front of her, and an expression that suggested she thought my entrance was the single most inappropriate thing that had happened in this room in the 20 years she'd been working in it. Across from her, a younger man, 30, perhaps 32, whom I didn't recognize but whom I'd seen arriving that morning in a car that wasn't from the usual household fleet. He had a tablet in front of him, and he'd placed his hand over it when I came in. 4 people, papers turned face down, a tablet covered, the energy of a room where something was in process. The woman at the head of the table spoke first. Her voice was exactly as I'd heard it through the 2-inch gap in the door, measured, lower than you'd expect. The cadence of someone who has conducted a very large number of conversations in rooms where the stakes were high. She said, "You knocked once." It wasn't a question. It was an observation being offered to me as an opening. I said, "Yes, ma'am, security concern. I apologize for the interruption." The legal advisor put his pen down. He was watching me with the focused attention of someone who evaluates situations for a living. The household secretary said, and her voice had a bristle in it that she wasn't entirely hiding, "This meeting is private and scheduled. Your presence here is." The woman at the head of the table raised one hand, very slightly, and the household secretary stopped. To me, what is the nature of the security concern? I had prepared, in the 11-second walk from the corridor to the door, an answer to this question. Not a fabrication, I don't do that, I've never done that, but a version of my concern that was precise and that I could defend. I said, "There's an individual in this corridor who isn't on today's cleared personnel list. He arrived before 08:30 and has been stationary outside this room. He has access to a document I wasn't able to read, but that appears to be a briefing note of some kind. I wasn't able to confirm his credentials through the usual channels before this meeting began, and given the nature of this." The younger man at the table, the one with the tablet, said before I'd finished, "That's my assistant. He was briefed in this morning." I said, "Through which process, sir?" "A beat." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Which clearance process was used for his briefing in this morning, sir? Because the standard clearance log for this building is updated at 22:00 the night prior and again at 07:00. His name isn't in either version." The legal advisor picked his pen back up. The woman at the head of the table had not moved. Here is the thing about a room where power is concentrated. It has a texture, a gravitational quality. You feel it on your skin and at the back of your throat. It presses. I'd felt it before in other rooms on other assignments, but I'd always been on the outside of it, providing a service to it, a function. I'd never been standing in the center of it, creating a problem. That morning, I was creating a problem. And I want to be honest about this. There was a part of me, a significant part, that was genuinely uncertain whether my security concern was the full and complete reason I'd come through that door, or whether it was a legitimate reason that happened to align with a deeper instinct about what I'd heard through the gap. I think it was both. I think that's allowed to be complicated. The younger man, the one with the covered tablet, said, "His credentials were communicated directly to the building manager this morning. The process was expedited." I said, "I'd like to confirm that, sir, if you don't mind. It will only take a moment." He looked at the woman at the head of the table. She looked at me. Then she said, "Close the door." I stepped back, closed the door behind me, facing into the room, not turning my back, and then remained standing near it. This was unusual. This was, by standard protocol, completely outside what I should have been doing. I was in the room, uninvited. The door was now closed. I was, by any reading of the rule book, deep inside a situation I'd put myself in. The household secretary was looking at me with an expression that had moved from bristle to something closer to disbelief. The woman at the head of the table said, "Your name." I gave it. She said, "How long in service?" I said, 12 years. She said, "Who was your most recent principal attachment?" I told her one name, one detail. Something moved across her face at that, not a smile, not quite, but a softening, as if that name had given her something she'd been calculating. She said, "You heard something before you knocked." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "What did you hear?" There is a code in this work about certain things that should not be described aloud in rooms that may contain unknown recording devices, which any room could. I was aware of this. I was aware, standing in that room, that the man with the tablet, whose credentials I still hadn't confirmed, was watching me carefully. I said, "I heard a conversation that raised a concern relating to the welfare of individuals who may not be present at this meeting, but who appear to be its subject." The legal advisor looked up. The household secretary made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The younger man said, "That's an extraordinary inference from a corridor." I said, "Yes, sir, it is." And then I waited, because that's what you do. You state the thing, and then you let the room decide what to do with it. The woman at the head of the table stood up. Not dramatically, she rose the way people rise when they've decided something and are moving to implement it. A smooth, deliberate standing. She straightened her blazer. She put her reading glasses back down over her eyes, looked at the papers on the table, which were still face down, and then she looked at the legal advisor. She said, "Give us the room." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, gathered his things, and rose. The household secretary did the same, though with considerably more visible reluctance. The younger man started to stand, and she said, "Not you, Edward." He sat back down. Then she looked at me. She said, "You stay." The legal advisor and the household secretary filed out. I held the door, then closed it again. And then it was 3 people in the Lawson room. The woman at the head of the table, the young man named Edward with the tablet he'd stopped covering, and me, standing near the door in my uniform with the absolutely surreal understanding that I had just been kept in a private meeting at the request of one of the most senior figures in this household. For about 10 seconds, no one spoke. Edward said, "I want it on record that I have concerns about." Edward, her voice was quiet, but it had the quality of a full stop. He stopped. She turned to me and said, "The concern you raised about my grandson's welfare." I said, "Ma'am." She said, "You can speak plainly with me. I've been doing this for a very long time. I know when someone is parsing words carefully because they're unsure of what they should say, and I know when someone is parsing them because they're genuinely trying to be accurate. You're the second kind." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Speak plainly." And so I did. I told her about the scheduling anomaly that Sonia Aldridge had mentioned. I told her about the man outside the door who wasn't on the clearance list. I told her about the document on the phone that I'd glimpsed for 2 seconds. I told her about the phrase I'd heard through the gap in the door, "Consent will be managed," and why, given the context, it had felt like something that needed immediate attention rather than something to file for later. I was as precise as I could be. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add anything I hadn't actually observed or heard. I gave her the components and I let her assemble them. She listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, without her expression shifting in any of the directions I might have predicted. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Edward said, "This is an intrusion into a private." She said, "Edward, be quiet." He was. She said to me, "What you heard, the phrase. Do you know the context it was used in?" I said, "No, ma'am, only the phrase itself and the response preceding it." She said, "Tell me the preceding response." I said, "Not without their consent." She was quiet again, then she said, "And who did you hear saying which?" I told her. Her expression did something then. A shift, small but visible to anyone looking for it, that told me that this was not new information to her. That she had known, perhaps, that something was being arranged, but that she had not known the specifics of what was being said inside the room. That the room she'd been in was the room I'd heard it from, and she'd been at the head of the table. Which meant what I'd told her wasn't briefing her on something unknown. It was confirming something she'd suspected about the people in the room with her. I need to tell you what happened next with the kind of care I've tried to bring to everything in this account. Because this is the part where I am most limited in what I can say, not because I'm protecting myself, but because the people involved, particularly the younger ones, deserve a privacy I'm genuinely committed to upholding. What I can tell you is this. The meeting that resumed in the Lawson room that morning, after the legal advisor and the household secretary were brought back in, was a different meeting from the one that had been in progress when I knocked. The agenda had changed, or rather, and this is the more accurate description, the underlying assumptions of the meeting had changed. Because when I told her what I'd heard, and when she confirmed for herself what I'd heard it alongside, the full context of that conversation, the things said before and after the fragment that had come through the door, she understood something about the meeting she was in that she hadn't fully understood before. That understanding changed everything. I was asked to wait outside, which I did. I stood in the corridor near the door, and the man in the dark jacket, Edward's assistant, whose credentials were eventually confirmed, though through a process that took longer than it should have, stood about 8 feet away from me, not speaking, not meeting my eyes, holding his phone face down against his leg. We stood like that for 40 minutes. I counted the portraits on the opposite wall. There were 7. I'd never counted them before. Sonia Aldridge came through the corridor at some point. I don't know how she'd heard, but she always knew when something was happening, and she slowed when she saw me, and our eyes met for about 3 seconds, and she kept walking. But as she passed, she put her hand very briefly on my arm. That was all. That meant something to me. When the door opened again, the legal advisor came out first. Then the household secretary. Neither of them looked at me, which told me something. Not hostility, just the forward-looking gaze of people who have just realigned to a new set of priorities and are already moving toward them. Edward came out last. He looked at me. His expression was complicated. I won't pretend I could fully read it. There was something in it that might have been anger and something else that might have been, and I know this sounds unlikely, a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. He walked past me without speaking. The woman at the head of the table came to the door herself. She looked at me for a moment, really looked at me, the way she had earlier, and she said, "You followed instinct over protocol." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I know that's not." She said it was right. Then, you understand I can't say that in any formal context. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "The young people this meeting concerned, they won't know what happened in here today, and I'd prefer they never do. What I hope they'll notice eventually is that certain things didn't happen the way they might have, quietly, over time." I said I understood. She said, "Thank you." Then she turned back into the room and pulled the door closed behind her. I've thought in the time since about what that meeting was actually about what consent will be managed was the summary of. I've thought about it more than is probably healthy, and I've come to a conclusion that I'll share carefully. There are processes that happen around people in high-profile positions, public figures whose lives are managed, to varying degrees, by layers of advisors and household staff and institutional expectation, that are not inherently malicious, but that can, if not checked, accumulate a kind of momentum that overrides the agency of the individuals at the center. The younger members of this particular family, and I'm speaking in generalities here, not pointing at specific individuals, were, I believe, the subject of a process that had been designed with good institutional intentions, but that had been allowed to develop in ways that moved beyond their knowledge or agreement. Something was being planned, something that would have affected their futures in significant ways. And the conversation that morning was the operational planning stage, the translation of a decision into a set of specific actions. The phrase I heard through the door, "Consent will be managed," was the casual shorthand of people who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was in everyone's best interest. That managing the consent process was just administrative tidiness. That the people being planned around would, eventually, agree, because they'd be shown why they should in the right order by the right people. That's not the same thing as consent. And the woman at the head of that table, who had herself authorized the meeting, who had herself sat in that room, understood that, once I'd given her the view from outside it. The view from the corridor, where the words unmediated were just words. Consent will be managed. From inside the room, surrounded by the logic of the process, with documents face down on the table and advisors with credentials and legal frameworks and the whole weight of institutional momentum. From inside that room, maybe it sounded like sensible procedure. From the corridor, it sounded like what it was. There's an ending to this story that I want to be careful not to overdramatize, because the actual ending was quiet. Things often are at this level. The drama happens in conference rooms and corridors, and then the doors close and the processes adjust, and from the outside nothing looks different, because that's how institutions work when they work correctly. They absorb and they self-correct and they move forward, and the corrections don't get announced. What I can tell you is that Edward's name disappeared from the household's internal contact systems within about a fortnight. His assistant, the man in the dark jacket, was gone sooner. The specific project or process that had been the subject of that meeting, I don't know its formal name, I only knew its shape, was either restructured or discontinued. Certain decisions that had been on the verge of being made about the lives of the younger members of that family were not made. Or not in the way that had been planned. That's what the quiet ending looks like from where I stood. Sonia found me again, about 2 weeks later, in the same staff corridor near the same linen cupboard. She said, "Whatever you did." I said, "Nothing." She looked at me. She understood this to mean, "Nothing we'll discuss here." She said, "Right," and then, "The young ones are fine, by the way, in case you were wondering." I said I was glad. She said, "You know you'll probably be rotated after this." I said I knew. She said, "Is that all right?" I thought about it, genuinely thought about it the way she was deserving of. Then I said, "Yes, I think so." She nodded, and she walked away, and that was the last real conversation I had with her in that building, because 3 weeks later I was reassigned to a different principal at a different property, and the Lawson room became something I walked past in memory rather than in actual corridors. I was on a different assignment when I heard, through the particular channels that keep certain people connected regardless of where they're posted, that the individuals who had been the subject of that Tuesday morning meeting had, over the months that followed, made decisions about their own futures in ways that were largely on their own terms. Small decisions, the kind that don't make the news, the kind that only matter to the people living them. But they were theirs. And that, in the end, is the whole of what I was trying to protect when I knocked once on an oak door and stepped into a meeting I hadn't been invited to. Not a crown, not an institution, not a protocol. Just the basic human thing. The right to decide your own life without someone else deciding how you'll be brought to agree with a decision already made. There are things I still don't know and won't. I don't know the full scope of what was being planned. I don't know whether the woman at the head of that table would have caught it herself, eventually, without my intervention. She's nobody's fool and never has been, and the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I think she was already suspicious of some of the people around her that morning. Maybe I just accelerated something. Maybe I confirmed something. Maybe the corridor was exactly where she needed a witness. I don't know. What I know is what I heard and what I did with it and what the consequences appeared to be. That's the territory of this story. That's where it lives in the honest measurement of what happened, without embellishment and without false certainty. I still wear the uniform. Different building now, different principal, different corridors and portraits and the smell of carpet that costs more than my monthly pay and the particular silence of a place where everyone is always listening without ever appearing to. I still feel the air change sometimes. Before anything happens, before any sound, just that shift, the building holding its breath. And every time I feel it, I ask myself the same 2 questions. If I'm wrong, what is the cost of acting? If I'm right, what is the cost of not? The answer doesn't always point the same direction. That's the honest truth. There have been times since that Tuesday when I've felt the air change and told myself, this is protocol and protocol holds, and you trust the system you've sworn to. And I've been right to do that. But there are other times. Times when the air doesn't just change, it stops. When the building doesn't just hold its breath, it goes somewhere else entirely. Somewhere quiet and waiting, the way places go when something is about to happen that can't be taken back. Those times I know. And I knock once. And I go through the door. Not every act of protection announces itself. Some happen in corridors that aren't watched, in rooms that history won't record, in the space between a 2-inch gap and a closed door. The people who benefit will never know what was said on their behalf. The person who said it will never be credited. And the work, the quiet, human, unofficial work of simply refusing to let something wrong move forward without someone noticing, continues exactly as it always has. Invisibly, undramatically, and in service of something that has no medal and no ceremony, but that matters more than both.